Welcome back. Welcome back from the break. Our next session is the need for the hour for presence for the future of a strong Hindu-American civic presence, and that's public service and advocacy. The name of the topic of the session is Ancient Wisdom, Modern Applications, the Emergence of Hindu-Americans in the Public Square. And I invite the moderator for the session, Suhak Shukla. She's a few words about her. She's the executive director and co-founder of the Hindu-American Foundation. That's headquartered in Capitol Hill in DC. It was founded in 2003. And she has helped steer the foundation to being recognized as a leading voice for civil rights, human rights, and religious freedom. So I'll let her take it away. Thank you.
Namaste. I think some of the panelists may still be outside. I'll invite, if you know you're on this panel, I invite you to please join us on stage. So for the next 75 minutes or so, we'll be talking about two things that they say should not be discussed in polite company, and that's religion and politics. But this is all a conversation that's geared towards the force for good that dharma can play in the public square. Today I'm joined by an esteemed panel, so I'll just very quickly introduce them. Their bios are available in your souvenir booklet, and they will be on the slide as well. But today we're joined by State Senator Jamie Eldridge, a member of the Massachusetts State Senate, where he represents Middlesex and Worcester, I got it right, I think, district since November 4th, 2008. We have Ohio State Representative Neera Jantani, who serves Ohio's 42nd district. We have Michigan State Representative Padma Kupa, who serves Michigan's 41st House District. We have HAF's former Director of Government Relations here from Washington, D.C., Jay Kansara. And we also have Attorney Vindhya Adappa, who serves as the Assistant General Counsel at Hebrew Immigrant Aid Services, or HIAS, the world's oldest refugee resettlement agency. I'd like to first invite State Senator Eldridge to give us some opening remarks.
So good morning, and I want to thank Priya Samant for inviting me to speak to the Threads Conference, and really honored to serve on this panel. My name is Jamie Eldridge. I'm State Senator for 14 communities in the Metro-West part of Massachusetts, and the district I represent, about 170,000 people, has probably one of the highest populations of South Asian Americans in Massachusetts, and so as a result, really developed a close relationship, including with the Indian American community, going to many different cultural events. I'll be going to the Diwali celebration in my district next weekend, and had the pleasure to have a number of interns and interact with activists and really try to best understand the contributions of the Indian American, Hindu American contributions to Massachusetts and to America. And I know that reading through the discussion around the Threads 2019 conference, it says that the purpose aims to bring together Hindu-American thinkers, artists, educators, writers, public policy makers, scientists, medical professionals, technologists, entrepreneurs, business leaders on one platform for a singular purpose: to share their stories and journeys, to celebrate their accomplishments and engage with each other face to face, explore and share ideas for a brighter, better America of tomorrow. So what I would say, just from my observations from interactions, and it sort of was sparked this week on Wednesday when I was taking the train into Boston to the State House where I work most days, is that I happened to sit next to an Indian American gentleman who introduced himself, and actually, coincidentally, both of his daughters had interned for me many, many years ago in my district office. And just in having that conversation, taking the train into Boston, in some ways it mirrored what one of my observations about the Hindu American or Indian American experience is that he had arrived in 1980, had gone right into high tech, and clearly had sort of sacrificed anything else he wanted to do aside from provide for his family and for his children, so that his children could have a better life. His children both went to very good universities, and both of them initially thought that they would go into the private sector, but in part through a number of experiences growing up in America, they both ended up, one ended up working for the Obama campaign, and another one ended up working for a nonprofit to help and serve refugees. And I think it's one of the, to me, very encouraging changes that I am seeing is really an increasing activism amongst young Indian Americans. And just a quick example is in my district, and I was very proud to know her when she was in college, as a young woman, Varshini Prakash. And I don't know if her name resonates with anyone here, but she is one of just two co-founders of the Sunrise Movement. So this is the national Sunrise Movement of young people that are leading the effort for the United States of America to get back to taking leadership on climate change. She and many other young people actually were in then Minority Leader Pelosi's office doing a sit-in protest. Of course, now Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. This is before the change in election. But that protest really sort of spearheaded a signal that young people really were demanding action from their elected officials to take action on climate change. And so this is someone that, you know, Varshini's second generation Indian American, grew up, was born here in America, and she was already taking national leadership beyond sort of her own community, if you will, beyond the Indian community, but really taking national leadership. And she is now traveling the country working on climate change. So I think in some ways that's an example of what's changed. And in terms of how do we expand that, how do we encourage that, I've been very pleased to be part of a number of organizations that are really looking to change that dynamic. In Massachusetts, about 10 years ago, a number of Asian American leaders created the Asian American Women's Political Initiative, recognizing that beyond the fact that to some extent back then there were not many Asian Americans participating in politics, but particularly there were barriers for Asian American women. And so what that program has done is provided interns, Asian American female college students, who are interning for different elected officials each and every year. So I was very pleased to each year have an intern that a couple of the years was an Indian American woman, getting involved in politics, learning the process. So I think that's an encouraging step. The thing that I say to all of my interns, really all of my staff, is, you know, when are you going to take that next step to run for office? I know one of the fellow panelists is an elected official, which is wonderful to see. What we have here in Massachusetts is I think you're going to see that next wave right now of Indian Americans running for public office. I would say generally in Massachusetts that hasn't happened too often, but there is a woman named Dimple Rana who is running for Revere City Council. It's a city near Boston, and she is running for city council this year. So I think you're seeing that change. I would say generally in terms of my greatest interaction with the Indian American community in my district tends to be focused on cultural celebrations. And those are wonderful to see. And I'm deeply appreciative of the contributions that the South Asian, the Indian American, the Hindu American communities have given back in, you know, areas such as academia and high tech, medicine, and so many other of the industries that really make Massachusetts such a strong, vibrant Commonwealth and have such a strong, vibrant economy. But as an elected official, it's been wonderful to see more Indian Americans get involved, you know, looking to run for office, serving at the State House, and that's very encouraging to see. And so certainly those who came in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, seeing their children, their grandchildren get involved in public service is truly inspiring. What I would say generally is that I think there does need to be a stronger network to encourage young Indian Americans, or really Indian Americans of any age, to get involved into the political sphere, to run for political office. I'm beginning to see some signs of that, but I would say generally that network is not as strong as other immigrant communities where I've seen people run for office more frequently. So those are my observations. I'm really honored to be invited here to speak. It's wonderful that this conference and this council is here in Massachusetts. I know there's many people from all over the country and all over the world here, so look forward to the chance to getting to know you, and I'll be serving on the panel as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Eldridge. A little height difference here. So political philosophy, statecraft, and diplomacy have a long tradition in Hindu civilization. Wisdom on nearly every aspect of these has been expounded upon in numerous sacred texts, from the Ramayana to Mahabharata, the Gita, and of course, Kautilya's seminal work, Arthashastra. So what have Hindu Americans naturally internalized from these and other dharma-based values and approaches? What more can Hindu Americans learn from our ancient wisdom for application in the modern world? The answers to these are key to understanding the importance of the emergence of Hindu Americans in the public square. Hindu Americans are represented at nearly every level of government, albeit still in very small numbers, as the senator pointed out. Hindu Americans made history in 2013 when the first Hindu was elected to the US Congress. Since then, more than 3 self-identifying Hindu Americans have joined and several more have run. In the previous decade, several Hindu Americans broke barriers at the local and state levels of government, 2 of them who are with us today. And a number have enjoyed prestigious government appointments at all levels. And today, a Hindu American is running for president. What most of these politicians share is a widespread respect for the spirit of inquiry, intellectual rigor, and pragmatism that they bring to policymaking. Hindu Americans have also become increasingly active in the public sector and in advocacy in the hopes of not only addressing the well-being of Hindus, but seeking solutions rooted in Hindu philosophy to address domestic and global concerns facing humanity. They too are respected for the spirit of inquiry, intellectual rigor, and pragmatism that they bring to public service. The future of a strong Hindu American civic presence depends on political representation and participation, advocacy, and public service. I'm joined today by an esteemed panel of public servants who will share their experiences and aspirations in these critical arenas. We'll talk about the mechanisms needed to expand the role, visibility, and influence of Hindu Americans in these spheres, while cultivating skills and opportunities at the grassroots level. We'll discuss how to effectively train, mentor, and develop support systems and networks for young Hindu Americans to enter and succeed in the public square. And lastly, we'll touch upon the positive value Hindu approaches bring to the proverbial table, approaches which are driven by a spirit of inquiry and sustained by values of non-harming, truth, moderation, and universal well-being, as well as a comfort with differences and a plurality of ideas and opinions, all in 45 minutes. What we don't get to in our moderated discussion, we hope that the audience will be submitting questions. So with that, I will turn to our panelists, and I'll start with Representative Neeraj Antani from Ohio. You know, you made history as running for office at the age of 23, I believe, is when you entered, so a very young age. I have a 2-part question for you. One, you know, what inspired you to run? Was it something in your upbringing? And I guess the second question was, what was your parents' reaction?
Well, you know, thank you, Suhag, and let me thank Dr. Bansal and Dr. Asthana and Sanjay and everyone at VHPA for having me. You know, I would say, you know, as far as upbringing, I think that an Indian upbringing is, you know, led me to office. I think that, you know, the dedication and hard work that is instilled in us, you know, as children, you know, led to success and success in all sectors, right? I mean, we see that, you know, in whatever industry. And so that's not necessarily what led to political success, but for me in politics as, you know, my chosen field. You know, as far as being a Hindu and thinking about, Suhag had sent, you know, a note out, you know, before the panel, you know, other religions are really about sort of, you know, doctrinal obedience, right? So, you know, I think that the best example is that, you know, Christians in Christmas, you know, their biggest holiday celebrates the birth of their Savior. Hinduism, our biggest holiday celebrates good over evil, right? And for me, I think that, you know, that has been instilled in me from the beginning, and politics is exactly that, right? It is good over evil. And so, you know, when people say, well, how did, you know, Hinduism affect you? I would say it, you know, it taught me good over evil. And that is what, you know, we in each of our own rights as elected officials, you know, fight for every day. As far as my parents, they still want me to go to medical school. So perhaps one day I will be a success in their eyes. But I will say, so I, as a conniving politician, learned very early on in life that when I was in the media, I could send it to my parents, and they would then send it to all my aunts and uncles and cousins to brag, because, you know, that's what we do. So very early on, we really pressed India abroad, because I knew if I got in India abroad, my parents would accept it, right? So in 2015, when I first got elected, I got on the cover of India Abroad, and it's been smooth sailing since.
Thank you. So Padma, I turn this question to you as well. You also made history. So Neeraj not only made history as being the youngest representative, but I believe the second Indian American and the first Indian American Republican. So Padma, you also made Michigan history in being the first Hindu American to serve in the House. You come from a strong interfaith background, and that was kind of where your roots lie. You were also my former boss as a board member of the Hindu American Foundation. Share with us, you know, what has this past year been like in office for you?
I would say thank you, Suhag, and thank you to the organizers of Threads. I just want to also acknowledge someone who is not here with us today, Abhay Asthanaji, for the mentorship that he has provided for me along my journey. And yes, we met when I was doing an interfaith panel for the HMEC. But the last year is sort of a culmination of everything I've done from childhood, actually. My parents came here when before I even started kindergarten for higher education. We lived here for 11 years, and you can tell that from my accent. But then we went back when I was 15, and so I had to learn how to be an American in India, right? Because I was already very steeped in what it means to be American. And so I finished my bachelor's in mechanical engineering because my mom always told me America wants doctors and engineers, and I can't stand the sight of blood. I love math, and so here I am, a mechanical engineer back in the United States. Husband is also an engineer. We moved to Michigan. And so I started serving the community because that's what my parents did. That was the reason that they went to India. And so the 20 plus years that I've lived in Michigan, I've been volunteering, and volunteering is the ultimate exercise in democracy. And so now I went from being the public Hindu in interfaith to being the public servant that I've always been, but in an elected capacity. And so it's been very rewarding, but also just entering a new arena. It's like when you start a new job, it takes time to get to learn what you're doing. And so I'm finding that same newness in this new position.
Thank you. So now we've talked a little bit about public service, and I want to shift a little bit to advocacy and ask kind of the same sort of question to Jay and Vindhya, and I'll come back to you, Senator Eldridge, as well. But Jay, you were with the Hindu American Foundation for almost a decade. What was your inspiration to join? And I'll ask you this question as well, because careers in the public sector are not common. They're also not necessarily lucrative. So as good Indian parents do, they worry. So what has the response of your family also been in terms of choosing kind of a non-traditional path?
So I'll start with the second question first. My parents thought I was crazy, and they still do in many ways because I have now left that position. So they're wondering what I'm really up to these
Go to
days.
medical school, Jay.
It was a very tenuous conversation that I had with my parents at that time, and over time they have accepted that I am not a conventional. I don't have a conventional career, and I most probably never will. And that's just the personality. All of us have different personalities, and we should accept that, just as there are different strands of the Varna Jati system in order to achieve economic viability. We have to accept that as well, that there are different strands of careers in our society globally now that we have to engage in order to achieve the same goal, which is, just feeding ourselves, putting a roof over our head, etc. I chose this path because I felt that it was the most, it was the path that provided me the most satisfaction, that I was able to contribute something directly to my community and directly to the story of our community. And I'll tell you what inspired me. I actually learned about HAF I think in 2007, and I was interning at the governor of Texas's office, then Rick Perry. And I was working in a specific office that dealt with international relations of the state. Texas, obviously, a big state, a lot of international business and companies are there. And the city of Houston has almost every consulate from every country in the world. And I remember this file folder. Not everything was digital in 2007, so they were still keeping paper files. And every country had a file in this folder system. And I remember looking at the India file, and it was really small, like really small. And then I looked at the Pakistan folder, and it was huge. It was like this thick, and this folder is filled with correspondence. And I'll tell you, in that folder, the subfolder that was the largest was from the Aga Khan community, because their leader, I guess, is a Pakistani citizen, most of their community are Pakistani Americans. And so I remember thinking to myself, who's doing correspondence on behalf of the Hindu American community to the governor and to other elected officials? And then I learned about HAF. And to be very honest, I thought to myself, I was going to work for HAF from that day on. And it was because I was working in I was working, for the governor of Texas, and I was wondering who is going to be our voice. And we have one, and that is the Hindu American Foundation.
Thank you, Jay. So turning to you, Vindhya, you were pursuing probably a lucrative legal career, and then you switched gears and now are working for the largest refugee resettlement agency. So what inspired you to make that shift? And also, what was your parents' reaction?
Namaste, everyone. Before I begin, I just want to thank Suhag for having me on this panel, and also my heartfelt thanks to JG, Abhay Uncle, Sanjay Ji for having us all here and for giving me this opportunity. So just like Jay, I'm going to actually start with the second question first. My parents also wanted me to become a doctor, and I'm the oldest of two siblings, so my younger brother is a third-year medical student, so they're very happy now. But when I was in high school, so I actually would say that my public interest career and my civic engagement is what inspired me to become a more dedicated Hindu and embrace my Hindu identity. So it's actually happened in a reverse way for me. But starting with the second question, I was on the science path. I was accepted into biomedical medical engineering programs for undergrad. I realized it wasn't for me, and then I switched my major to business in undergrad itself, and then went to law school straight after. And initially, my parents were also a little worried and scared. We don't really have any attorneys in our family. And back then, I think we just had very low numbers of South Asians in general going into the law. But now everything has worked out. So in terms of what inspired me to go into public service, well, from the time I was a teenager, I knew I wanted to be an attorney because I felt like lawyers really had versatility and power in society to affect public opinion and to work on causes and issues that are affecting us at all levels and all generations and in all countries. So I made my decision then to become an attorney. And I was very drawn to civic engagement and human rights and public service because I just felt like we're here on this earth for a very short time. It's important for us to give back in a specific, way that means the most to us. And that's really just kind of the rudimentary idea I had. I should note that as a teenager into my early 20s, I was actually very confused about my spiritual identity. And I grew up quite insecure to call myself a Hindu. As I started to explore my spiritual path and delve more into Hinduism to realize what's really about, alongside pursuing my legal career, that's really when certain principles and values in Hinduism clicked with me personally. So I'll talk about two specific principles and how they tie to my career now in public service. When I was 22, I was working for the UN in Tanzania in law school at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And I worked on a genocide case. I went to Rwanda, I saw genocide memorials, and I was really heartbroken at that point. I felt like a huge bubble for me had popped, and I saw firsthand kind of the type of destruction that human beings are capable of inflicting. I remember that night I spoke to my brother, who, albeit being younger than me, is actually one of my greatest mentors and gurus. And he said to me at that point, just do your dharma. You have to keep one foot in this world and one foot out of it. You have to be detached and attached at the same time, but you can't really lose yourself in this work. And seeing how much that principle, the principle of dharma and detachment, how much it actually relates to public service and suffering, and how well it allows us to contextualize what is happening in the world today, I think that pulled me closer to Hinduism and away from my insecurity that I had faced as a teenager. Fast forward a couple of years now, and I work for a Jewish resettlement agency where we help everyone all over the world, from Central Americans to South Americans to Muslim refugees from Iraq and Syria. And the principle of Vasudeva Kutumbakam has really clicked with me here. For me personally, as a social justice attorney and as someone who is civically engaged, Vasudeva Kutumbakam means standing in solidarity with people from all over the world and having a true sense of global community and egalitarianism. I am just so in awe of how Hinduism sees the entire world as one community. In a world today where we live in silos and we think, well, that isn't affecting my tribe, that isn't affecting my people, that isn't affecting my caste, it is so refreshing to come from a faith identity that really sees every community's problems as every community's problems. And so hand in hand with my career, I've been able to deepen my love and my understanding of my dharmic roots.
Thank you. So Senator Eldridge, do you come from a family that ran for office? Was this something new? What inspired you to serve? You've been serving for over a decade now.
Yeah, so just for the record, my parents thought I was crazy too,
Okay, there we go.
so I perhaps share that connection with the Hindu American community. But I'm in my 17th year as a legislator, so including my 6th term as a senator, and I really appreciate what Vindhya said and just sort of comment on my interaction with Hindu American constituents of mine is that, you know, there's one friend in particular who's very involved in my hometown with getting different public projects approved, fire stations, schools, helping support policies in the town to sort of come together and support one another. And I'm always encouraging her to run for office. And I think she probably won't run for office, but I think what she has been, which I'm hoping inspires under other Hindu Americans in the district, is she's stepped up and become parts of organizations that are not specifically associated with being Indian or Hindu. So she's a leader now with the League of Women Voters. So she's sort of, you know, gone beyond the Indian community in Acton and connect with people to work on progress to serve, you know, everyone in the community. And so it's wonderful to see. And, you know, I would just say, given the sort of successes and achievements of the Hindu American, you know, community, whether in Massachusetts or across the country, is encouraging more to do the same and get involved with boards and organizations that are serving, you know, everyone in a community. Because I just think of how much of a difference the community can make if that sort of next step could be taken.
Wise words. So for this next question, I'll just have you all start with Padma and work your way down. But what challenge have you faced in your work that you didn't anticipate going in, and how did you face it?
You know, the fourth graders that come to the Capitol from our public schools for their field trip are one of the best things about my job. And they usually ask me the simple questions, you know, what is the favorite thing about the job? What is the thing you like the least about the job? And I always say one of my biggest challenges is the drive, particularly in Michigan winter, to Lansing. It can be very daunting. But I will tell you the thing that I now see as one of my biggest challenges is to fulfill the role that I have now as an ambassador. As these young children come in, we have one painting in the entire the capital of the state capital, and that is of the governor, Jennifer Granholm, of a woman who has been governor. And so a little girl asked, you know, can a woman be governor? And so, you know, just the fact that women have not been in leadership. And my role as a legislator and what that means, since I look different from everyone else who has preceded me as the first Indian American woman. And there's a little girl that came on a field trip, and she was really bouncy. She was just very active, touching things. And I take them onto the chambers of the House floor, because I can do that when we're not in session. And the teacher kept on reprimanding her and telling her to keep her hands to herself and not to ask too many questions. And then at the end of her trip, as we took a group picture with everybody and then they were leaving, she reaches into her backpack and pulls out a little book and she says, "Representative Koopa, can you give me your autograph?" And I realized how important my role is and what it almost scares me to think what I have to do to live up to this, because it's this little girl. She looks like me. You know, my mom used to send me with oil in my hair and 2 braids and a little bindi. And she looks up at me, and it just, her reality just changed because I'm there. And so some days, even when I don't want to drive all the way to Lansing and deal with some of the politics and the polarization that exists, I remember that this is something that I can continue to do by being a representative, by being an elected leader. I've changed what leadership looks like. And so staying true to that and being the best of who I am in that position, following my dharma.
Thanks. Jay?
So I would say, the biggest challenge I think collectively we all face at HAF, and Suhag probably still faces it on a daily basis, is just the sheer volume of correspondence that comes from us from the Hindu American community to solve, you know, issues related to immigration or workplace discrimination. And I feel that as a community that is fairly sizable in numbers, I mean, we're 3 to 4 million in the United States, it is very difficult if our institutions are not properly staffed and given the resources they need in order to succeed. And therefore, it is incumbent upon all of us in these rooms to not only support the Hindu mandirs, the temples in our localities, but to also support advocacy groups who can be the voice of our communities and professionally address the concerns, whether they be workplace discrimination, hate crimes, human rights issues abroad, or a number of things that impact Hindus on a daily basis and impact the lives of us. And I feel that's where that was the biggest challenge, is because you feel obligated to address everything, and frankly, we can't. This was a career for me, and therefore at some point in time I had to have a personal life and I had to engage in other things, and so therefore you know, at some point you have to stop checking your emails and you have to stop worrying about whether something gets done or not, because at the end of the day you do have to, as Vindhya said, you have to be somewhat detached from this in order to be able to work the next day and to continue doing it as a career. So I would say that's the biggest challenge that I remembered.
Thanks, Jay.
I would say the biggest challenge is, as an elected official, is just the continuous outreach to, you know, all different communities or stakeholders on multiple issues, and just how much you have to do that outreach to gain trust and sort of connecting on a particular issue or particular community. So I'd like to think that, you know, part of the reason I was invited to the conference today is that I have done a lot of outreach to the South Asian community because I understood that to some extent, because I'm not Hindu, I'm not Indian, there was initial sense of, you know, perhaps lack of trust. And so going to all those different community events, gathering that trust so that now I'm able to work with members of the Hindu American community on different issues that they might care deeply about. And then beyond sort of different immigrant communities, just working with different stakeholders on issues. I do a lot of work around climate change, and Massachusetts in some ways has been a leader on that issue, but there are so many different organizations, so many different perspectives about how do we tackle climate change from a state perspective, and just continuously going out to all these different groups and meeting with individuals. And it really is, you know, just eternally happening as an elected official. The legislature in Massachusetts is what's known as a full-time legislature. So, you know, my schedule is 6 or 7 days a week. I have a full schedule today and tomorrow. But you really need to do that in order to gain the trust and connecting with a wide variety of people to actually make progress on issues. And I absolutely love the job, but it's certainly something, a reminder that unless you're continuously making those contacts and making new contacts, especially in a state in Massachusetts where 25% of the residents are foreign-born, unless you're doing that, you're really not connecting in a way to make true sort of transformational progress.
Thank you, Neeraj.
I'm actually going to flip the question, if that's okay. I'm going to talk
Absolutely.
about something that I thought was going to be my biggest challenge that wasn't. So my biggest challenge is and has been and continues to be my age. People in politics love young people until young people actually try to do something. So 5 years ago, when I was first running, you know, my team and I, we sat down and we said, okay, well, what's our biggest challenge going to be? And we thought it was going to be my Hinduism, right? My district, I am the only Hindu Republican elected official in the country. I'm it. I'm all you got, okay? And so my district is, as Dr. Khanna here knows, is 95% white, is 95% Christian. There are 0 synagogues and 0 temples in my district and 126 churches, right? So we thought it was going to be my Hinduism, and frankly, my being Indian. And it really has not been, which, you know, to me has been, you know, a sigh of relief. You know, we thought we were going to come under attack and face questions and face, you know, all of these different things about, you know, my ethnicity and about my religion. But, you know, I don't pretend to speak for the other party, but as a Republican, what we have found is that, you know, Republicans care about your positions And so long as you vote with your conservative values, they're for you. There have been a few instances where we've gotten questions of, hey, what is your religion? And then when you say that you're Hindu and not Muslim, when you say you're Hindu and Indian, they ask about what good Indian restaurant they should go to. But it ends up being okay. Now, and I speak often at HAF events, and I do talk about a potential future challenge, which is that people generally don't know what Hinduism is, right? And so, they have a neutral opinion. That's why when I say I'm Hindu, they say, okay, they shrug their shoulders and we move on. But, the tide can turn easily against us, right? And so, we have to be, I think, very vigilant in that, right? I know that, HAF did a lot of work against this Reza Islam, documentary or hit piece, as I call it, on CNN a couple years ago. And things like that in popular culture can turn very quickly against our community. And so, that I think could be my future biggest challenge. But because of, VHPA and HAF and a lot of different organizations, I think that, we are working, every day on that.
Thanks. India.
Yeah, so I think I can talk about the challenges I faced in two major departments of my life. So first, my actual professional legal career, and then in the second bucket, through my advocacy work that I've done for the Hindu American and Indian American community. First off, as a female, woman of color, Hindu American attorney, I don't think that my struggles are necessarily rare. I think a lot of things I've seen and faced are pretty emblematic of what a lot of women go through in the legal profession, period. And one concept that I've really thought about, which has caused me to delve deeper into my Hindu beliefs and question, what I stand for, is this idea of internalized misogyny that we see in a lot of corporate workplaces, and I don't think the nonprofit and social justice sector is necessarily less susceptible to this. I can give you an example. So a unnamed colleague of mine a few years ago, or a couple of months ago, told me, as a woman, we shouldn't wear bright colors in the workplace. It's going to reduce our chances of getting a promotion. And I thought about this very deeply, right? I come from a religion and a culture that is beautifully vibrant, that is beautifully colorful. I've grown up with festivals like Holi and Diwali, wearing beautiful Indian dresses that my aunts have gotten stitched for me from Andhra Pradesh, where my parents are from, and other parts of India. And somehow this just didn't make sense to me, because something as personal as dress and appearance should never be subsumed under an image or concept of what somebody else thinks, right? So in my small act of personal defiance, I decided to come to work wearing a bright orange scarf that I bought from Varanasi, and I had it over my business suit. And that's when it really hit me. And everyone complimented it. Nobody really thought it was weird or anything. And that's when I realized I don't need to subsume, my sense of identity or dress or appearance under a Western imperialistic notion of how women ought to behave or talk or dress in the workplace. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately as well. I would say another challenge I face in the professional realm is just sheer unfamiliarity, right? So I work for an organization built on Jewish values, which are beautiful, and there's so many commonalities between Judaism and Hinduism. But there is also this sense of exoticizing Eastern faiths and Eastern culture, and some questions, albeit well-intentioned, can come off as ignorant. So the way I've tried to combat this is just using any opportunity as much as possible to educate my colleagues, my stakeholders, and my peers about really what I practice and what I believe in. Most recently, and I was really happy to do this, October 27th commemorated the one-year anniversary of the horrific shooting and tragedy that happened in Pittsburgh last year at a synagogue. in which, you know, Hayes was directly named and implicated. And I was asked to give a few words in memory of the victims, and I tied my words to Hindu Dharma, to the concept of universal compassion, family, and solidarity. And I really saw that small chance, that small moment as a way to connect with some of my Jewish and Christian brothers and sisters and eliminate some of the barriers we face. I'll say to the last piece, another challenge I faced, and this time now in my advocacy and community engagement work, is really around mobilizing Hindu American youth. Unfortunately, and I know this because I dealt with this personally, we have really been victims of an apologist attitude, you know, constantly having to defend our practices or explain them, at times being made to feel ashamed or guilty of being Hindu or practicing in a certain way. I'm very passionate about young people, and sometimes when I go to different events and when I want to try to bring more college students and high schoolers into the fold, I deal a lot with kids who feel insecure, who feel afraid to identify themselves as Hindu, or who feel afraid in light of the kind of the socio-political context we see now and buzzwords like Hindu nationalism and Hindutva that are being thrown around. And really, what I want to do and what I hope to do in the future is just to continue to educate, work in solidarity with peers and organizations to educate our youth, help them realize what a beautiful culture they come from, and help them realize that being American and Hindu are not mutually exclusive, and in fact, they're very intimately tied together, and you can have a career in advocacy, practicing your Eastern religion, and also being in a Western world.
Thank you. So we have about 13 minutes left, at least, of our formal comments. If you have questions, I encourage you to write them down, and someone will bring them to me, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. I am going to give you a question that I did not email any of you ahead of time, because I just like to roll that way. But, you know, last week, or maybe it was 10 days ago, the biggest thing I think that's been in the news is Kashmir and the abrogation of Articles 370 and 35A. And many of you may be familiar, but there was a hearing at the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Subcommittee on South Asia. And I think that there's probably consensus, at least in this room, that we saw maybe an erosion of the fact-finding process. And it's not just there, but in many other realms that we're seeing partisanship erode public trust, whether it's the media, whether it's our governmental institutions. Do you see this in your various spheres? Do you see this, and what are you able to do about it? I'll start in the middle. So Senator Eldred.
And I'm sorry, an erosion of
Public trust.
public trust. Well, I think certainly in some respects, in Massachusetts, in some ways, the Massachusetts legislature, which those of you who are from Massachusetts probably know, it's a very democratic state, but generally most legislation that passes in Massachusetts is fairly bipartisan. There's not too many Republican elected officials, but most legislation passes in a bipartisan manner. But what I have seen in the Republican Party is that the Massachusetts Republican Party has really shifted very far to the right, such that the governor of Massachusetts, Governor Charlie Baker, who's more of a moderate Democrat, has essentially created a separate entity to support more moderate Republicans. And unfortunately, what I've seen is that the Massachusetts Republican Party, is putting out, mailings that I think are fairly inaccurate, not only directed at Democrats, but at moderate Republicans. So I certainly think there's been some erosion on that side. I think on the Democratic side, and I'm I guess categorized as a progressive Democrat, there's certainly those on the left that I think have also engaged in a lot of attacks if someone doesn't have a pure record on certain issues. So I think I've seen that as well. And as far as the media, and this is, you know, obviously not just a Massachusetts phenomenon, and it's really sad to see, is just that local media has really gone away. So, you know, in the district I represent, there once were approximately 25 weekly papers. Now there's about 10 weekly papers, and most of them are owned by multinational corporations. So there's not a lot of local content. And so, you know, the question that a lot of us are asking in the legislature is, you know, who is going to cover, you know, the work we're doing and make sure that, you know, quite honestly, as elected officials, we're held accountable. And so that's certainly going away, and what can be done to replace that or supplant that, whether it's, you know, blogs or local media, and how do people get, you know, perhaps compensated to do that kind of work to cover what's going on in the media. And therefore, what's going on at the State House is much less covered. There was a time when I started out of the legislature, there were approximately 10 daily papers, each of whom had a reporter assigned to the State House. Now it's really just, you know, the Boston Globe and, you know, maybe one other publication. So in that sense, I think that's eroded, and I'm not sure what's going to replace that.
Thank you. Neeraj.
So I'll talk about partisanship and then public trust, and then on Kashmir. You know, I'll make a defense of partisanship. Partisanship exists because there are real differences. People have real disagreements, right? If we talk about, you know, foreign policy, there are Americans who support Pakistan, and there are Americans who support India. Why would we tell them to say, well, abandon your principles and come together? Partisanship is good. Discourse is good. Disagreement is good. The problem is when disagreement becomes disagreeable, right? And in the media and in Congress, it's become what I call a real daytime soap opera, right? It is no longer about discourse on real issues. It is a soap opera meant to have a political victory, right? And the national media and the National Congress play right into that. And I think that erodes the public trust. When the public does not see its elected leaders and its fourth estate, the national media, advancing an agenda to do something for the public good, that is when public trust is eroded. On the issue of Kashmir, I know the question wasn't about that, but I will say, as a Hindu elected official, it is very frustrating to me. You know, the Indian American and Hindu community have done incredible work in supporting those of us, and I have received a lot of that support, and I am very thankful. But why any Indian or Hindu American would ever support an elected official who has spoken against the revocation of 370 is beyond me, okay? And I'll go a step further. When a member of Congress who looks like us speaks against the revocation of 370, which is effectively saying that what happened to Kashmiri Pundits is okay. When someone that looks like us does that, that is probably the worst thing that could happen. Because then a member of Congress who doesn't look like us, when they see someone who looks like us do that, well, they say, well, that must be okay then. If a Hindu Indian American member of Congress is against the revocation of 370, is against the government of India's actions, then it must be okay, right? And that is a huge problem, right? And so, you know, not to be partisan, but the American left, there is a problem. There is a problem with what I call radical Islam and their influence on the American left. And when you have CARE and you know, HAF will show you their budget versus CARE's budget, advancing Pakistan's agenda, which is an anti-Hindu agenda, we have a big problem. And so, you know, I would urge you and urge everyone in your networks to think about who you're supporting and whether they are actually doing things for Hindu Americans.
Padma.
So I will say, while we want to have our values as a Democrat or as a Republican or as an independent, I think hyperpartisanship causes lack of public trust. And one of the things that my background as a Hindu is that there's no one right way. There are many ways to the truth. Ekam sat vipraha bahuda vadanti. And that's what I think is why I won. I'm the first Democrat to ever hold this seat. I'm the first immigrant to ever hold this seat. I'm the second woman. And so the reason that the constituents of Troy and Clawson in Michigan gave me their trust is because I didn't believe in this hyperpolarization where, like Neeraj said, where we are disagreeable, but also I think that things need to be negotiated. And we're seeing where we're unwilling to negotiate. And my experience is sometimes I have to negotiate not only within my own family, but within my own self. Because, you know, there might be a day where there's Halloween might fall on Diwali, so which one do I celebrate, right? I mean, those simple things happen for us. And so I think it's really critical that we show that we are able to navigate these spaces as elected officials with reestablish public trust. As a state representative, I also carry a very specific, I've been a public Hindu. I've been a board member of the Hindu American Foundation. Locally, I started an interfaith organization, so any question about Hinduism always came to me. I was the public Hindu because every institution I went in wearing a sari with a bindi and speaking about being Hindu. So there's never any doubt that I was Hindu. And so people come to me now both to defend the issue of Kashmir and the abrogation of 370 and also to defend the plight of the Muslims in Kashmir to ensure that human rights is not violated. And the thing I will say is, if we don't look at the historical context, the global community, the national community, the local community has to make sure that they're educated. And that is one of the reasons that I ran, is because of education. I think there's really an opportunity for us to educate as Hindu leaders, as Hindu elected officials, what people don't know, that what happened in 88, 89 needs to be talked about to explain where we are today. What happened in 1947 when Kashmir chose to be part of India, and what has happened to the state of Kashmir since, whether it's Pakistan-occupied Kashmir or 1972 when part of Kashmir has become part of China. So you have to look at the whole historical context. And so as an Indian American with a background in advocacy through the Hindu American Foundation, I definitely feel I have a unique opportunity to talk about this as a much larger issue than just what is happening right now.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Vindhya and then to you, Jay. Vindhya, go ahead.
So I've often thought about this issue, erosion of trust in the government, polarization, and I can speak about it, I think, within the context of my identity and work as someone who's not an elected official, but who works for a social justice organization. At times, I really have to struggle with fitting my identity and my values and my beliefs within particular situations or silos or contexts that really matter to me. So for instance, I'm a lawyer working for a Jewish, liberal, progressive organization that really stands by protecting the rights of refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants. And yes, this administration has made our work extremely difficult and at times very, very discouraging, both from a professional and from sort of a mental perspective. And I'm grateful for the support of my colleagues and the work they do in helping us, really fulfilling our mandate and our mission. And as someone who has identified as a lifelong Democrat and as a progressive millennial, so to speak, I also find myself very confused and heartbroken with a lot of with a lot of the Hindu-phobic and alienating language coming out of the Democratic Party. And at times, I really do find myself ideologically confused and sometimes party homeless, not really knowing where to stand. On one side, I do support general, social justice issues, human rights issues. Generally, I'm more left of center, but now with the inflammatory rhetoric and Hindu-phobic verbiage that's coming out, at times I'm at a loss for words and don't really know where to turn. I've decided that my way of handling this is really to just do what I can in my own capacity to try as much as possible to bring these two identities together and be as inclusive as I can of other people and their disagreements. As an attorney, I greatly cherish the art of argument and nuanced debate. And it seems like we're really losing this art, not just in American society, but really in political circles around the world. We see politics becoming increasingly polarized. You're either a leftist communist or you're an alt-right conservative. And I sort of miss the intellectual nuance in the debate that we really should be valuing as an enlightened society. One example of how I've tried to fit myself within these different identities is recently, actually working with Jay, Hyas was able to take on the case of a Bangladeshi Hindu woman who is now applying for asylum. This is, I think in Hyas's history, this may be our first, if not one of the first, cases we've taken on of an actual Hindu minority. And so this allows me to serve my community and my people while at the same time really honoring those social values I stand by, which is protection for refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants. Turning to 1 second on the Kashmir issue, there's a lot of polarized talk around this, but I guess one experience I can briefly talk about is I did attend a Stand with Kashmir event with a Kashmiri Pandit friend of mine a couple of months ago. Very, very open-hearted and just willing to learn. I honestly didn't know much then about sort of Stand with Kashmir's platform or their speakers or materials, but I just wanted to go and learn more about this issue. And what truly horrified me at this event was prominent academicians and members of the intelligentsia and reporters actively denying that targeted killings happened with Pandits, actively denying that there was an exodus, actively denying genocide. The first step towards reconciliation and healing is to accept that a wrong occurred. When you deny that, you deny someone's very existence and very identity. And that has certainly caused me a lot of grief, both personally as a Hindu American and also politically as someone who traditionally did vote Democratic. I think a lot of young Hindu Americans are caught in this fold and in this schism. And whether this is going to change remains to be seen, and how the Democratic Party is going to tackle this remains to be seen as well.
Thank you, Linda. Jay.
So the partisanship that we experienced at that hearing last week on October 22nd was very palpable, and particularly two members of the Democratic Party who were extremely antagonistic towards the one panelist who had actually been in Kashmir on the day of the abrogation, as well as was a credible journalist with a very high degree of professionalism. Was extremely disheartening to me and to many of us, including HAF. So I want to rewind a little bit, and I want to put this in the context of what had happened actually last month, or 2 months ago now, and that's Howdy Modi. I actually worked on the committee that brought the members of Congress there, and also worked with the president and his advance team. And of course, the president's presence at Howdy Modi was a question mark for us. How was our community going to react? Because 80% of our community does statistically vote Democratic. And that auditorium had about 40 to 50,000 people, which is essentially, about 1% roughly of the entire Indian American population, albeit the vast majority of those people were from Texas, but you can say that that was a sample size. Not one person booed for the president, not one person was disrespectful or heckled him, and they gave him a standing ovation when they agreed with him, and my wife, who doesn't vote or would probably never vote for Donald Trump, didn't stand for him at all, but she was respectful, and I think that really made an impression on the president, and because he knows this as well. And he knows that, and I have to say, as someone who's not necessarily a fan of his rhetoric, but I'm also not necessarily turned off by the things that he does, and I can look at things from an objective point of view. I have to say that was probably his best speech that he's ever made in his entire presidential career. Because he knew his audience. He knew that his audience, those people were not necessarily his supporters, but they could support the emphasis that he puts on the U.S.-India relationship and on the value of the U.S.-India relationship, and then on Hindu Americans and other communities in the diaspora as a whole. I feel that sentiment gets lost in the broader narrative now, and I worry that India and support for the U.S.-India relationship and essentially support for Hindu narratives is going to become a Republican pet issue the way that Israel has become a Republican pet issue these days. And I do worry about that. And we as Indian Americans need to wake up to the political reality that we cannot let this happen either. We must engage both sides of the aisle effectively in order to ensure that our narrative does not become usurped by anyone for any one political agenda. And I hope that we can collectively as a community come to some mature ourselves and mature the institutions that we invest in to bring that about. And we should be engaging Republican lawmakers, Democratic lawmakers, independent lawmakers effectively in order to ensure that our way of life does not become a cause for any one party to use their bully pulpit for. It is a real concern that I think many of us who are engaged in this process have.
Thank you, Jay. So I've gotten a lot of good questions from the audience. I think some of them were answered organically by some of your responses. So I thank you for that, and I thank you for being willing to be thrown under the bus by me on a very hot topic. But I mean, if the kind of conversation that we've had here is reflection of what we need more in Washington, D.C., I think we should share this footage. So before we end, we have only 5 minutes. For those of you, if we didn't get to your questions or you feel that you didn't get an answer, lunch is next. So you can let them eat, but maybe ask your questions then as well. But you know, maybe if we could get each of you very briefly, there's five of you in 5 minutes, so 1 minute each. What do you tell the next generation that's interested in doing something that still is, in some sense, non-traditional for our community? We'll start here.
My advice would be very simple. Just do it honestly and believe in yourself, like to your heart's content. Apart from being a lawyer, an activist, and an advocate, I'm also a singer and a professional recording artist. For me, being active in the arts and in humanities has allowed my potential, my greatest potential to come out. And something my mom always tells me is do what you're good at. Don't do something that you would be mediocre at. I knew from the beginning that if I was going to be a doctor, if I was going to go into the STEM fields, I would be unhappy, miserable, and I would fail at it. Why? Because it doesn't cater to my natural strengths and my natural abilities. Now, doing what I do, I feel like I'm able to make a greater impact. And I just want to tell also young people that there's really no set convention or way to live life. The greatest disservice you can do is not being true to your passion. If you follow that and if you have resilience in that, it really does lead you to greatness. My message also for parents would be to encourage your children to explore the humanities. We need more Hindu Americans in politics, journalism, media, entertainment, comedy, music, what have you. And that's really how we can bring our opinions and our voices into the American fabric and into the American story.
Thank you. Neeraj, we'll just go down the line this way now.
So I agree with what Vindhya said. The only thing I would add is that, we talk often about, politics, and I'm glad we have people who are involved in sort of the public sector but not elected, is that, being involved in politics is not just running for office, right? I think that, in fact, we may tell too many people to run for office, but, voting and being a part of civic society is as important. Joining Rotary clubs and boards and commissions and charitable organizations outside of our own community, are just as important. And some of this is natural progression. I think that there's a lot of consternation in our community that we don't have enough lawyers, we don't have enough politicians, et cetera. What we have to understand is that the generation that came here, which is many of you and as my parents too, follow the path of a traditional immigrant community. The first generation tries to survive, and then they try to thrive, and then the next generation gets involved civically and culturally and politically and socially. And so I don't really stress about this as much because it's going to happen. I am probably as weird as it sounds, I'm probably the oldest of that generation, right? I think that there will be, people who follow me, but I'm probably the first to do it. And so, I think that some of that is naturally occurring and will naturally occur. We just have to let it. And so, and to Vindhya's point on the parents issue, if you can even just make it like 10% easier, right? That would be great. Just 10, let us be like 10% more. That would have made my life a lot easier. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I would just touch upon something that Representative Antani said early, and that Vinny had touched upon, that I'll say as someone who's not Hindu, is that Representative Antani said that part of his influence to run for public office is the base of the religion of good over evil. And I think that really, I really would encourage Hindu Americans to really communicate more about the religion to non-Hindus, because I think more often than not, as someone who's an elected official, the events I go to for the Indian community, they tend to be very, very cultural, Diwali and celebrating certain celebrations, but really nothing about the religion. And I think educating non-Hindu Americans about the roots of the religion and how that influences your values and the work that you do is really critical. Vindhya talked about her work for a Jewish organization serving refugees, and I would respectfully suggest that I think in many ways the Jewish community is a great model, because there are the sort of cultural celebrations for the Jewish community, but also in the district I represent, which also has a large Jewish community, very strongly communicated how those values interact with supporting immigrants and the story of many Jewish Americans' journey to America, and roots going back much earlier, connecting those values to issues that I think translates into a stronger connection to people who aren't Jewish, to the Jewish community, influences the policies and what the community advocates for. And so I think that's a very strong model, and certainly I would like to see that happen at more of the Hindu or Indian American events that I attend, and I think it'll lead to a greater impact of the community in general. Thank you very much.
I would encourage us in our local communities to think outside the box and also to build alliances with other communities. And I'll give two examples that came out of Howdy Modi. Obviously, it was on a world stage, so we were very cautious and aware of the optics. And so two things we did. Number one, we had Spanish media, Univision and Telemundo, cover the event. So to expose a Spanish-speaking audience, which arguably may become the largest demographic in the United States between now and 2050 or so, whatever the year is. We wanted to expose them to India. We wanted to set that narrative. So I felt that that was a good win for us. The coverage was actually really good. You can Google it. The second thing we did was, this was the 150th year of Mahatma Gandhi's birthday, and there clearly is a nexus between Mahatma Gandhi's vision and his message and Dr. Martin Luther King, who also visited India. And we wanted to combine that message, and so we had an Indian a cappella choir perform with a black gospel choir. They performed a fusion Vaishnava Janato and Amazing Grace rendition that really it gave people goosebumps, including myself. And you can Google for the video, and it was quite a moment that we share. And I feel that we need to think outside the box also with our culture, we are universal, so let's be universal.
Thanks, Jay. Padma.
So I go back to what I said earlier, which is volunteer, but then I'm going to also say, as a former board member of HAF, give to organizations like HAF that advocate, and also give to candidates, give to people who are in office, not just our own, but people who reflect our values. I'm sure Neeraj and I wouldn't mind you talking to us about our campaigns and where we're going next.
NeerajChatani.com/donate.
electpadmakuppa.com as well. But I think that you have to look at, Indiaspora did a report, and I don't know how many of you are familiar, but how our community, we build a lot of temples, but it's time now to build the infrastructure to live in this country as proud Hindus. We've educated children, like people who have grown up like Vindhya, who I'm just so proud to hear her at the other end as a fellow Telugu. I'm just very excited that she went into this. I would say, along with Neeraj, not everyone has to run for office, because as you know, if we don't get reelected, there's no income. And so to find a job in the public sector, as Jay, Suhag, and Vindhya have all done, I think it's really important, because you can influence policy. If we care about water, I went to Hyderabad at the age of 15. I could not stand the fact that you couldn't open the tap and get a glass of water. So we want to protect water infrastructure. As Indian Americans who understand what this is like, as Hindus who understand the essential element that water is in our lives, we could advocate on these issues. So I think it's really important that we learn to volunteer, to invest, and to be outspoken. Jane do is not enough anymore, right? I mean, this is the thing. We have to do something. If our children and future generations of our, Hindu Americans are to be successful, and future generations of Americans are to be successful, we need to protect our democracy.
Thank you. So hopefully this panel has left you hungry to change the world and hungry for lunch. So thank you all for your active participation, and thank you to our panelists for your honesty and your wisdom. And with that, namaskar.